Chapter 6. Before getting up the following morning, Tabitha heard Alice in the kitchen starting breakfast. She knew she should get up and remind the older woman she was going to be the one cooking, but she just wasn't ready to roll out of bed yet. Instead, she rolled close to Bert and sighed contentedly. Marriage was something she'd always dreamed about, but her first day of being married to Bert had surpassed all expectations and dreams. He was gentle with her, and he seemed to genuinely care about her. What more could a bride ask for? Bert woke slowly, his hand stroking her hair. "Is it morning already?" he asked. "Alice is in the kitchen cooking breakfast, so I have to assume it is indeed morning." He sighed. "Come out with me to do the chores, and you can meet the kittens." "I would love that. If I fall in love with one of them, may I bring it inside today?" "Sure," he said. He still wasn't certain about having a cat inside the house, but if it made her as happy as it seemed to, he was more than willing. He needed her to stay happy so they could continue to have days like they'd just had. He'd never dreamed he'd find a wife who was so willing in bed. His former fiancée had been afraid for him to even kiss her. They both dressed quickly, and she went to the kitchen to tell Alice what they were doing. "I appreciate you getting breakfast on the table this morning." Alice smiled. "I thought it might help you if I did breakfast every morning. That way you don't have to wake early, but you can cook the other meals, which should give you enough cooking to do to keep you happy." Tabitha hugged the older woman. "Thank you. I'm off to look at the kittens in the barn now." "Oh, will you be choosing one for the house?" Alice asked. "Yes, I will. I'll start work on a cat bed later today then." "Are we still planning to work on applesauce today?" "Yes, we are. I cannot wait until Bert tries my applesauce. I want to just make mine today, and if he doesn't like it, we'll use his mother's receipt tomorrow." Alice nodded. "We'll do that then." Tabitha met up with Bert at the front door, keeping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "It's chilly. We'll have snow any day," he told her. "Better get used to cold, because ours lasts months at a time." "Oh, that's awesome. I can't wait." He laughed softly. "You're so happy about everything I tell you about living here. I hope you'll still be happy after 9 months of winter." "Why not? I enjoy cold weather." They walked out to the barn together, where they saw George milking one of the cows. "I was coming out to do that," Bert said to George. George shrugged. "I thought it would be nice if I took over the morning milking. Gives you time to sleep a little later." Bert grinned. The older man was going to give him a chance to be with his wife in the mornings. "How kind." "Thank you. I appreciate it. Tabitha and I are here to see the kittens. They're over in the corner where their mama keeps them." Bert led Tabitha to the corner, and there were 4 kittens wrestling and playing there. Tabitha sank to the floor, where she sat with her legs crossed, watching the kittens. One was pure black, one was pure white, and the other 2 were a mix of the 2 colors. She watched them until one of the black and white kittens plopped down on her lap and nudged her head against Tabitha's hand. Tabitha immediately scratched her ears, and the kitten purred against her hand. "This is the one," she said to Bert, who had been standing over her watching the kittens. "All right," he said. He took the kitten and turned it over. "It's a girl. What are you going to name her?" Tabitha frowned. "I don't know. I'll watch her personality and come up with something that suits her." She got to her feet and took the kitten back from him, cradling it against her chest. "Let's get you inside, and we'll get you some warm milk. Or maybe some eggs for breakfast. You're going to spoil that kitten, aren't you?" Tabitha grinned at Bert. "Of course I am." Together they moved back toward the house, with Tabitha carrying the kitten. Once inside, she went straight to the kitchen with her new friend, setting her on the floor. Alice had already warmed milk, and she put it in a bowl, and then put a bowl of it on the floor for the little one. The baby licked it excitedly. Tabitha watched it as it licked at the milk, glad it wasn't making a huge mess, which is what she'd half expected. "Do you think you could make an egg or two for her as well?" she asked, not even looking at Alice. "Oh, of course. I made eggs, bacon, and toast for you and Bert." "Sounds good to me," Tabitha said, unable to take her eyes off the little ball of fluff. "The food is on the table in the dining room whenever you're ready for it." "That means now," Bert said from behind her. "Thank you, Alice." "Of course. And I'll keep an eye on the little critter while you eat." "Does it have a name yet?" Alice asked. "She doesn't," Tabitha said. "Now if she were a tabby cat, I'd name her after myself, and we could all call her Tabby. But she's not, so we'll have to think of something. I kind of want to get to know her little personality first." The kitten looked up at Tabitha, its whole face covered in milk. She giggled, but she followed Bert to the dining room. As they ate their breakfast, she felt the kitten playing under her skirt. She giggled more than once during breakfast, and Bert simply kept smiling at her. "Well, I'm glad we had kittens when you arrived," he finally said. "Oh, me too. It's nice to have something so small and snuggly that belongs to me." "Hopefully our babies will be small and snuggly as well," he said. "Hopefully our babies will be numerous." They were halfway through their meal when Alice came into the room and set a small dish of eggs on the floor. The kitten walked to them, reached out and touched them with one of her front paws, and then took a small bite. She must have liked it because she made little growling sounds in her throat as she gobbled them up happily. "What are you doing today?" she finally asked. "We're moving the cattle closer to the barn. It'll be easier to keep track of them and keep them fed if they're not out on the far reaches of the property." "That makes sense. Do you keep them close all winter?" "We try to. Oftentimes, they get out and get stuck in the snow. We'll be working on keeping them in place the whole winter. I want to get a permanent winter enclosure for them, but I'm not sure it'll be done before spring." "You'll love spring here," he told her, smiling. "Why's that?" "Tons of calves. Some will need to be bottle fed, though usually only 1 or 2 per year. Their mothers will die, or they'll reject them." "Oh, that's sad. Why would a mother reject her baby?" she asked, feeling as if she had something very much in common with the calves that were rejected. She'd always loved them the most. Usually only the first time mamas do that. They're not really sure what to do with the calf. If I can't get it to start cleaning the calf, I put grain on the calf's back, and usually that will kick in their motherly instinct. If not, I'll bottle feed. I'd love to help with the bottle feeding if it needs done this spring. If you still feel that way in the spring, I'd be happy for the help. Usually that's left to me or George, and sometimes Alice, depending on how many we have. Sometimes it takes multiple hands to get the work done. My cowboys, who live in the bunkhouse, don't usually mess with the orphan calves. I'm going to learn a lot more about ranching in the next few months, won't I? My father has always been a farmer, but he grows crops. We've only had a cow for our own milk over the years." "You don't talk about your father much. What's he like?" Bert asked. Tabitha smiled. "When my mother's not around, he's absolutely wonderful. He would sneak away from her to drive me to school on very cold days. We would take walks together, and he would pick flowers for me. When Mother was around, he had to act like she was the most important thing in his entire world though. So he usually mostly ignored me when she was there." Bert frowned. "Why couldn't he treat you both as if you were important?" "It would make my mother angry. I don't think I understand your parents." After breakfast, he brushed a quick kiss across her lips. "Have a good day. I'll eat lunch with my men, so I won't see you until supper time. Plan on having applesauce for dessert," she said, even though she was thinking of making an apple cake as well. Hopefully he'd enjoy being surprised. It was a little startling how little she knew about him yet. The kitten followed her when she went into the kitchen with Alice. "Are we ready to get the dishes done, so we can start on applesauce?" she asked. Alice smiled. "Fall has always been my favorite time of year. I love harvesting a garden and canning everything I harvest. It just brings a bit of joy to my life. I will be working by your side. I kept up a kitchen garden for the people I worked for back east, and then it was my job to can everything. It was hard, though, because there were so many children to mind as I was doing it." "What about the woman you worked for? Didn't she help?" "Not if I was there. She figured she needed to get every penny of work out of me she could." Tabitha looked around. "Where can I find the jars for canning?" "They're in the cellar." "Oh, I didn't even know we had a cellar." "Show me where, and I'll go get some." Alice smiled. "You're definitely going to be doing your share of work around here, aren't you?" "If I'm able to, I will always do my share and more." She found the trapdoor for the cellar, and went down. Thankfully, the cellar had a few windows, and it wasn't difficult to find what she was looking for. There was a burlap sack down there, and she filled it with the jars, knowing she would need to be careful to get them all upstairs without breaking them. While she scrubbed out the jars, Alice worked on peeling and coring the apples she'd saved for applesauce, and then they switched places after a while and Tabitha peeled while Alice scrubbed the jars. They worked easily together and talked about nothing and everything. As they worked, the kitten went from running a mile per minute and exploring everything to sleeping on the floor beside Tabitha's foot. "As soon as the applesauce is done, I'm making her a little pillow to sleep on," Tabitha said, looking down at the sweet kitten. "Have you come up with a name for her yet?" Alice asked, eyeing the rambunctious kitten with trepidation. "She definitely enjoys being in the house with us. Will you let her out at times?" "Oh, of course. I want her to get used to being inside first. She's a roly-poly little thing, isn't she?" "Oh. I could call her Polly. 'Cause she's a roly-poly." Alice smiled. "I like that." "I do too." "All right, Polly it is." The kitten woke then, arching her back in a stretch, before spinning around and settling back down. "I think she likes her name," Alice said. "I think so too." By the end of the evening, they had 40 jars of applesauce ready, and there was some left for supper that evening. "Do you think Bert would like an apple cake for supper?" Tabitha asked. "Not just apple cake?" Alice asked. "Oh, no. I'll make some ham and potatoes for supper, and the cake will be dessert." Now that sounds like it would be appealing to him. "I do have a ham ready to cook in the icebox. I meant to make it for Sunday dinner, but the two of you went and got married, and it slipped my mind." Tabitha grinned. "Then that's what I'll make. Ham, mashed potatoes, carrots, and apple cake for dessert." Alice smiled and nodded. "He'll like that. But make twice what you think you'll need." "Why?" Tabitha asked. "Because he's going to eat that much after a long day working with the men. And he'd never admit this, but he doesn't much like the bunkhouse cook's food. So he's always hungry when he works all day and doesn't come in for a lunch break." "All right. I'll make lots of food." Alice nodded. "Do you want help with supper?" Tabitha glanced at the time. It was already 5, and Tabitha knew Alice would need to be getting supper on her own table. "Not at all. I've got it." "All right. I'll see you in the morning then. Remember, George and I will take care of breakfast and morning chores." "We really appreciate that." "I've never been much of a morning person," Tabitha said. "Neither has Bert, but he won't admit it." Alice left then, off to go cook for her husband and herself. Tabitha put the ham in the oven and then mixed up the ingredients for the cake. While the cake was baking, she peeled the potatoes and got a jar of carrots from the cellar. Then she put the potatoes on the stove and found a small pot to heat up the carrots. They hadn't taken the time to bake bread that day, so Tabitha hoped Bert would be all right with just what she'd made. It was her first real meal to fix for him, so she wanted it to go well, and she wanted him to love her cooking. Hopefully, he would, but knowing Bert, he would let her know either way. He wasn't a man to hide his feelings. Chapter 7. After supper, which Bert raved about, they retired to the parlor for a while. He had a new newspaper in his hands, and Tabitha worked on sewing a pillow for little Polly, who played in and out of her skirts. At one point, she climbed onto a table, laid on her back, and watched Tabitha sewing. She laid like that for a good long while. "You are so silly," Tabitha said, looking at her upside down. Bert peeked out from behind his newspaper and grinned. "I see you chose the most entertaining kitten of the bunch." "She chose me," she said, thankful to have a kitten in her life. She'd already laughed more that day watching the antics of Polly than she had in any day of her memory. Tabitha worked more quickly on the pillow, wanting the kitten to be able to sleep on it. If it was just her, she'd have let the kitten sleep with her, but she had a feeling Bert wouldn't like that very much. She tied off the last of the thread and put it on the floor, just as Bert put down his paper. "Are you ready for bed?" he asked. She nodded. "And more than that, Polly is ready for bed." She'd made a pink pillow with leftover fabric she'd found and made it flat and long. That way the kitten would be able to sleep on it when she was older as well. She removed Polly from the table and put her on the pillow, smiling as the kitten sniffed it, and then moved to lay down on the rug. "I guess she doesn't like it," Tabitha said with a frown. "Give her time to get used to it," Bert told her. "She'll like it more as she is more familiar with it." He reached his hand out to take hers and lead her to bed. "Let's sleep." She chuckled, raising an eyebrow. "Sleep?" she asked. "Is that really what you're planning to do?" He pulled her to him and kissed her. "Eventually." "I like the way you think." Asterisk. On Friday, right after lunch, Tabitha got ready for tea. She had no idea if she should dress up for it or if she should wear her day dress. She sought out Alice, who was washing dishes in the kitchen. "Should I dress for tea with Mrs. Sinclair?" Alice nodded. "I would." Gladys was supposed to marry Bert, but she was scared of him, and ended up marrying Charles Sinclair instead. Charles is very soft-spoken and kind. He suits Gladys well, but Bert would rather you dressed to spend time with her, I think. I didn't know they were affianced. Tabitha frowned. "I'll wear my nicest dress that I didn't wear to get married in." "Should I take anything?" "Oh, there's no need for that. Gladys is very sweet, and I'm not surprised she reached out to you right away." "Well, I think I'm excited to get to know her then. Trust me, she has no lasting designs on Bert." In fact, they were still engaged when she married. It was funny how afraid she was every time she was around him. "I told him over and over that she wasn't a suitable wife for him, but he simply wouldn't listen." Tabitha nodded. "All right. Thank you for that information, and now I'll go dress, and you can tell me if I look good enough." Alice laughed. "You're beautiful, Tabitha. Of course, you'll look good enough." Tabitha almost wished she didn't know about Gladys being engaged to Bert as she dressed. How was one supposed to react toward the woman who had once broken her husband's heart? When Tabitha was ready, wearing a blue gingham dress which brought out her blue eyes, she stepped into the kitchen for Alice to see. Alice was making supper that night as well, as Tabitha would be gone for a while. Alice turned around to look at her, and she smiled, nodding her approval. "You look wonderful. That dress really brings out the blue in your eyes. I do think your eyes are very striking when contrasted with your hair." Tabitha smiled. It was something she'd heard her entire life. "Thank you." She took a deep breath and saw it was 2:15. "Are you sure you don't want to come with me?" Alice shook her head. I don't think that would be wise. She went to the door and pointed off in the distance. Her house is just over that hill. All right. Wish me luck. I would if you needed it, Alice said. Polly started to follow Tabitha out of the house, but Alice blocked her with her foot. Sorry, baby, but you're staying with me. Alice picked up the kitten and snuggled her under her chin. Tabitha enjoyed the walk to the Sinclair's house. It was getting chilly, so she wore her shawl, but not so cold it was unpleasant. Bert had assured her it soon would be unpleasant, but there hadn't been any snow yet. Certainly there would be soon. At the top of the hill, she spotted the house, and was able to walk straight to it. There was a path down the mountain that she was sure had been walked many times. At the house, she could see a plowed-over garden, and there was a pretty front porch with a swing for two. It looked like a very cozy home. She raised her hand and knocked at the door. Gladys came to the door with a smile on her face. Perfect timing. I just put Melanie down for her nap. She's a beautiful child, Tabitha told her. It seemed it was an easy topic. I tried to talk Alice into coming with me, but she said she would stay behind to make supper. Alice certainly does have a mind of her own. Come in. The tea is on, and I made cookies for us to snack on. Sounds wonderful. Tabitha took a step inside the pristine home. Do you have a housekeeper? Your home is immaculate. I don't, Gladys said. I guess I obsess over housework a little more than most women. I like it to always be perfect in case someone stops by. Tabitha liked to keep a clean home, but she had other things to do as well. I brought you a jar of applesauce. Alice and I made it on Monday. Oh, thank you. I know how much Bert loves his applesauce. You used his mother's receipt, I guess? Tabitha shook her head. Actually, I used my own. He said he liked it better. You must be an outstanding cook then. Perhaps I'll have you give me tips. My Charles is always happy with how the house looks, but I think he'd like it if my cooking was a little better. At least I'm no longer burning everything as I did when we were first married. How long have you been married? Tabitha asked. She wanted to ask about her time with Bert, but it would be better if Gladys shared that on her own. 5 years, Gladys said. I was supposed to marry Bert, you know. Really? Tabitha asked, acting as if it was new information. What made you marry Charles instead? Gladys sighed as she poured the tea. My father arranged the marriage with Bert. He never really talked to me about it, but he came home from working on the farm one day, and he told me I was marrying Bert. Oh, that would have made me angry. It didn't make me angry, Gladys said, sitting down at the table and taking one of the cookies for herself. It made me scared. There's just something about Bert that was always unnerving to me. He'd kiss me, and I'd want to run away screaming. Tabitha smiled. That is not my reaction to his kisses. I should hope not. Anyway, I met Charles on a walk one night. He never was religious, and he doesn't go to church and never has. He's about 10 years older than me, and he's a farmer, like my father. We talked and walked, and there was just something about him. It was only about a month before I was supposed to marry Bert when Charles asked me to marry him. I hadn't told him about Bert, you see. Oh, that must have been a surprise to Charles. I explained the situation, and then I said yes, I'd marry him. But we'd have to do it right away. Tabitha's eyes widened. You didn't break it off with Bert first, did you? I was much too afraid of him to break off our engagement. I went home, and I begged my father to break it off, as he was the one who accepted the offer of marriage for me in the first place. He refused. He wanted me to marry Bert because he grew corn. He thought if I was married to Bert, Bert would feel the need to buy his corn for winter feed for his cattle. She shook her head. So I talked to Charles, and we married the next day. My father hasn't spoken to me since. Tabitha understood then. Gladys would have been miserable married to Bert. Do you know the secret to keeping Bert from getting too bossy? She asked. Gladys shook her head. Kick him. I kicked him within 5 minutes of meeting him. Twice. Gladys giggled. I wouldn't have dared do such a thing. I have threatened it again, but I don't believe I've kicked him again. He just brings it out in me. I cannot imagine he's pleased when you kick him. You're really not afraid of him, are you? Tabitha laughed. I'm a little afraid of what he makes me feel. It's a good thing we're married, because I would have been willing to do anything with him after that first kiss. I much prefer the softer touch I get from Charles. There's no great passion between us, but he doesn't frighten me either. Tabitha thought of the passion between her and Bert and smiled. I don't think we should be discussing our passion for our husbands, should we? She understood that Gladys would have been a terrible wife for Bert, and that she was the woman he was meant to marry. If this visit told her nothing else, she would do well to remember that. I just wanted you to understand what happened between Bert and I so you would know I wasn't a threat to you and your marriage. Thank you for that. Your cookies are delicious, Tabitha lied. The other woman really did need help in the cooking department. Thanks for lying, Gladys said with a grin. So where did you come from? Tabitha explained briefly what had led her to coming west to be a mail-order bride. I'm just thankful that Bert let me spend that first night I was here. And that Alice convinced us both we belonged together. Alice was always telling me that we shouldn't be together. How odd. I think we'll both agree I'm better suited to Bert, Tabitha said with a grin. Oh, for certain. Tell me about your little girl. Gladys's face lit up at the mention of her baby. She's 3.5. She's so smart. She knows all her colors, and she can count to 10. Oh, that's wonderful. You'll have to come back someday when she's awake. You should bring her to my place to see my new kitten, Polly. Is she a barn cat? Gladys asked. I know Bert doesn't think animals should live in houses with people. No, she's a house cat. Bert let me choose between the kittens his barn cat had birthed, and Polly walked over and sat on my lap. I'm excited to have her. You are seeing a very different side of Bert than I ever did, but it sounds like he makes you happy. Tabitha nodded. He does. We have a great deal in common and enjoy spending time together. I'm happy for both of you, but especially for Bert. His personality, it's a bit overwhelming at times. I'm just glad he found a match for it. Me too. Tabitha was still thinking about all Gladys had said as she walked back home. It was odd that two women could see the same man and one find him incredibly appealing and the other find him frightening. Tabitha was certain she would find Charles a boring man. Maybe she would meet him one day. Alice had made a pot roast, mashed potatoes, and carrots for supper. They'd made several loaves of bread that morning, so Tabitha was certain it would feel like a feast. After Alice left, but before Bert returned home, Tabitha cut off a small piece of meat and put it into the kitten's bowl. Polly made growling sounds until Tabitha walked away, leaving the kitten to her meal. Tabitha had just finished setting the table when Bert came into the house at the end of his day. That smells good. I'm hungry. Alice cooked for us tonight. I was at Gladys Sinclair's having tea with her. He nodded. Did you have a nice time? We did. She wanted to assure me she had no desire to get between us in any way. He frowned at that. Why would she? She hated being engaged to me. No, she was just afraid of you, Tabitha said. Why would she be afraid of me? He asked. That woman never did make any kind of sense. She seems like she's afraid of a lot of things. But she's kind, and I feel like she could be a real friend, if that doesn't bother you. Bert shook his head. I won't dictate who your friends are. I have no harsh feelings for Gladys. I'm just glad she called it off when she did. There was no way I was going to be able to go through with the wedding. Why not? She asked. Every time I tried to kiss her, she'd turn her head away. If I managed to kiss her, she'd start crying. Can you imagine having a wedding night with her? Well, I can't imagine a wedding night with any woman. Or any man but you. I kind of liked our wedding night, though. He smiled. I thought it was pretty wonderful myself. In fact, if you're up for it, I'd be happy to have another wedding night tonight. She laughed at that. I'm game if you are. Tabitha couldn't help but be thankful for the passion between them. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to be in a marriage like the Sinclairs. With no passion, what was the sense in being married? Oh, she knew it wouldn't always be that way between them. But she would keep their passion alive for as long as she could. She enjoyed it too much to do otherwise. Chapter 8. As they drove into town for church on Sunday, Tabitha was thinking about the man she'd come to Wyoming to marry. She had yet to meet him, though he'd paid for her train fare, and she'd corresponded with him. I wonder why Jacob Small paid for me to come west and then never showed up to meet me at the stagecoach. Bert shook his head. As far as I know, the man can't read. He's rarely sober. Maybe someone decided to play a trick on him? But that would be one mighty expensive trick. There aren't too many in this area who could afford to just spend that kind of money for a joke. It bothers me. I feel like I should have had some loyalty to him, but I sure do prefer your touch to an insane man's. At least I think I would. You were the first man to kiss me after all. All other men should be jealous then. She bumped him with her shoulder. I am glad I married you and not someone else. Is that so? Does that mean you'll promise to never kick me again? But that's why you wanted to marry me. Because I kicked you. Bert looked at her. How did you ever guess? It was obvious. Is there anyone Jacob is close to? Bert shrugged. Still thinking about him, are you? He rarely even goes into town. I've met him only once or twice. Once he was driving his cattle through town. I'm not sure what he was really driving, but I sure didn't see no cattle. Maybe you could drive me down near where he lives after church. Bert sighed. Will you stop worrying about him if I do? I can't make a promise about that, but I'll feel better about myself. Besides, you should be taking me on romantic drives all the time. He shook his head. I work all the time. Romantic drives are for men who don't know how to work. We both know that's not true, she said. I work hard while you're off working, and I can make time for a romantic drive. He groaned. I'll take you for a romantic drive to see the man you were supposed to marry after lunch. I'm eating first. She put her hand flat against his stomach. I would never ask you to go hungry. You keep touching me like that, and we're turning around, going home, and missing out on church. We have to worship God to thank Him for making us the way He did. It's so much fun to procreate. He laughed. It certainly is. We'll have more fun with that later. When they reached the church, she went in, feeling a little more confident about facing all the strangers in the church. She wasn't as shy as Gladys, but she didn't like to face a large crowd of people she didn't know, either. Immediately, Bert went off to talk with a group of men dressed similarly to himself. Tabitha assumed they were all ranchers. Tabitha moved to a pew near the one they'd sat in the previous week. Alice was there and had saved a seat for her. Thank you for not making me face all these people alone. I don't think I could tear Bert away from his friends if I tried. Oh, you couldn't. Men say women gossip, but I think men are worse than women most of the time. Other women came over and introduced themselves, and after the third person, Tabitha leaned over to Alice. We need to have a small party one day. Just so I can invite all the ladies over at once and get to know them better. Alice wrinkled her nose. They're easier to take individually. A group of women can be difficult to be around. I agree with you wholeheartedly, Tabitha said. I'm glad I have you at my side for all these things. I may not have a mother-in-law, but I'm glad I have you. I'm glad I have you too, Alice said. Bert was smart when he married you. So glad he and Gladys never made it to the altar. That was a disaster waiting to happen. Another woman stopped to meet Tabitha. I'm Betty Gamble. My father is a rancher here in town. I didn't think anyone would ever agree to marry Bert. Tabitha got to her feet. I don't think there's anything at all wrong with Bert, she said. Oh, no, but he just doesn't seem compatible with women, does he? Betty shook her head. I do think he is just too forceful for most women. I hope he's gentle with you. Tabitha was disgusted that the other woman would talk about her husband that way. She leaned forward so her lips were close to the other woman's ear. I try to be gentle with him, but sometimes I just can't help myself. Please don't ask him to see his bite marks. Betty's eyes widened and she covered her mouth in shock. I don't think we should be discussing things like that in church. Just responding to the conversation you began, Tabitha said, moving to sit beside Alice. I don't want to talk to you anymore. Go bother someone else. After the odious woman had walked off, clearly offended, Tabitha felt Alice shaking beside her. What? Tabitha asked, refusing to back down from what she'd said. She looked over at Alice and saw the older woman was laughing. She's been trying to catch Bert's eye for years. I think that was her concession speech. It better have been. I want nothing else to do with her. What did you whisper to her? Tabitha blushed. I told her I try to be gentle with Bert, but she shouldn't ask to see the bite marks. Alice began laughing even harder. I do love you, Tabitha Blander. And I love you, Tabitha said, joining in the laughter. Maybe I went a bit too far with that. Not at all. I've been trying to get her to shut her mouth and walk away for years. You did it quickly. You deserve an award of some sort. Bert and George came over to sit down before the service. What's so funny? Bert asked. Alice and Tabitha just laughed harder. If anyone comes to you concerned about your welfare, it's all Alice's fault, Tabitha said, tears starting to stream down her face. Bert and George exchanged a look. It might be time to separate the two of them, George said. It's not, Alice said. We just have similar senses of humor. Bert looked at George. That can't be good. I'm sure it's not. Tabitha elbowed Bert. Shoo, it's time for church. Tabitha and Alice both had a hard time staying serious throughout the sermon. Something would strike one of them as funny, and they'd both laugh. Bert didn't look nearly as amused as Tabitha felt, though. After church on the drive home, he asked, What had you two so tickled during the service? Tabitha thought about it for a moment and decided to tell him everything. Betty something or other introduced herself to me before church. He groaned. She's a menace. She said something about how surprising it is to see you married. She didn't think a woman would ever agree. That's ridiculous, he said. She's had her pa approach me a dozen different times with the idea of the two of us marrying. I wondered if it wasn't something like that. She seemed to hate me from the moment we started talking. Tabitha shook her head. She actually told me that she hoped you were gentle with me. There are words I want to call her that are not meant for mixed company. What did you tell her? I told her I tried to be gentle with you, but she shouldn't ask to see your bite marks. He looked at her with wide eyes for a moment, and then he started laughing. Is that why you and Alice laughed through the whole sermon? Tabitha nodded. I couldn't help myself. She stomped off after telling me I shouldn't say such things in church, but she started the whole thing. Tabitha sighed contentedly. Usually I don't think of good retorts like that until it's too late. I was pretty proud of myself. I can see why you would be. He shook his head. But you're right. What you said was deserved, and if she ever says anything like that to you again, I'll make sure she knows better. Thanks for not being angry with me about that, she said softly. I really wasn't sure how you'd react, but Alice and I had fun with it. I think you did the right thing. Perhaps not in the right environment, but something like that needed to be said. You know, you're shaping up to be a halfway decent husband. He shook his head. It's a good thing I never expected obedience from you. After lunch, he took her for a drive to see Jacob Small as she'd asked. When they got to where they could see the river, he pointed toward her. That's him. The man was at least 50 if he was a day, and he had a crook, like would be used with sheep. Instead, he was surrounded by pigs, and he was singing to them. His voice made her cringe. I still feel I need to meet him, she said. All right. He drove down closer to the water's edge, and stopped at the side of the road there. Let's go. You're going with me? She asked, a little surprised. I may not be the gentlest husband in the world, but even I wouldn't let my wife go alone to meet a crazy man. And trust me. The man is crazy. I see that. She made her way down from the road to the bank of the river. Hello, she called loudly. The man looked startled. You a cattle rustler? He asked. No, sir. I'm Tabitha. I came here to marry you. The man took off his hat and scratched his head. Well, that's mighty nice of ya, but I'm married to Mabel there. He used his thumb to point at a tree behind him. You're too late. Did you send a letter to a matchmaker to find a wife? She asked. Nope. Don't know who would have sent a letter like that. All right. The man didn't appear drunk to her, so he must truly be insane. I guess I should be on my way then. Yep. I need to move the cattle to another pasture. This river likes to flood in the spring as all the snow melts. It does? Oh, yes, it does. I brought you a few sandwiches if you'd like to have them. That would be right nice, he said, waiting for her to get the sandwiches. Then he saw Bert holding a small bag with the sandwiches in it. How come you're with him if you came here to marry me? He asked. You weren't there when I got here on the stagecoach, so this nice man told me he'd help me find a husband. Turned out that husband was him. You stole my wife? Jacob asked, staring at Bert. I suppose I did, but you didn't seem to want her, or you'd have been there. Bert really wished he knew who had sent the letter to her. Just give me my sandwiches, and we'll call it even. Bert happily handed the sandwiches over. He'd give the man sandwiches every week if that's what it took to keep Tabitha. When he helped her back into the buggy, he could see that she was a little shocked at what they'd found. She waved at Jacob as they drove away. Thank you for saving me from that. Bert nodded. Let's go on a real drive now, where our destination isn't a crazy old man who thinks his pigs are cows. Who feeds him normally? Bert shrugged. Never really thought about it, but he definitely manages. He's thin, but doesn't look like he's starving. Maybe he roasts one of the pigs every once in a while. I guess it's possible. He drove her through the entire area, pointing out different homes and buildings. Was this area founded by settlers from the Oregon Trail? He asked. Yup. Everything in this area was. All those people looking for free land. Can you imagine? Don't even want to think about it, she said. The land offices must have been crazy busy when wagon trains came through. Oh, they were. At least that's what my grandfather told me. My father was just a boy when they came, and he remembers very little of the journey, but my grandfather talked about it like it was a big adventure. My grandmother only talked about how hard it was. I have a feeling it was much harder for women than men. Women would have left behind everything they knew for a life of cooking over fires and keeping their kids from drowning in rivers. Men just drove and thought about the land they'd get. She shook her head. I would not have wanted to be part of that. I'm usually up for any adventure, but you would have had to drag me kicking and screaming. He chuckled. I can't imagine you backing down from any kind of challenge. He stopped the wagon and got down, walking around to help her to her feet. This is where the first settlers camped around here. Taking her hand, he pulled her to an area that was obviously once a huge campfire. They cooked over this fire. They went all that way, wintered in Oregon, and then they came back this way in the spring, ready for a new life. I simply cannot imagine that much hardship. My grandmother kept a journal of the whole thing if you're inclined to read it. I tried once, but she talked about chores so much that I really got bored with it. I'd love to read it. Do you know where it is? On the bookshelf in the parlor. I'll show you as soon as we get home. Grandmother was a grumpy old lady, but who wouldn't be after walking 2,000 miles? I know I would. Tabitha nodded, smiling. I think I'd still be complaining my feet hurt. He chuckled. They got here in 1853. Hopefully, you wouldn't still be complaining. It's only been 45 years then. You underestimate my ability to complain. He pulled her to him, hugging her close. Remind me to never give you any reason to complain then. Oh, you'll know it if you do. She grinned up at him. We should get home. I need to make supper, and I have a feeling there will be other needs we should see to. He laughed. I do like the way you think, wife. Chapter 9. Tabitha had been in Wyoming a little over a month when a man came to the door. She opened it and didn't recognize the man as one of Bert's friends, and she certainly knew most of them, at least by sight. May I help you? Are you Tabitha Murphy? He asked. The man was short, a couple inches shorter than Tabitha, and he wore a suit. His hair was bright red, and his eyes were brown. I was. Now I'm Tabitha Blander. Tabitha looked at the man in confusion. I sent off for a wife for my father, but I missed the stagecoach when it came in due to an accident. I've been trying to find you ever since. Are you Mr. Small then? The man nodded. Jacob Small Jr. I live a few towns away, and I wanted someone here to look after my father. Tabitha shrugged, not knowing exactly what to do. I thought I had been abandoned. I married a kind man who asked, and I'm quite happy with him. But I paid for your train fare, and for your matchmaker to find you. Don't you think you should have been loyal to that? I had my husband take me out to meet your father, Tabitha said. He had no idea who I was, and he claimed a tree was his real wife. Then he traded me to the man I was already married to for 3 sandwiches. Your father doesn't need a wife, Mr. Small. He needs a caretaker. As that may be, I paid for you to come here to be his wife. You went back on our bargain. I will have to sue you for breach of promise. Tabitha stared at the man in shock. And as your father's wife, where would I live? Would I need to pretend the pigs he treats as sheep are really cattle? You'd figure it out. Now, either come along with me, or I will get my lawyer involved. I'm afraid you'll need to get a lawyer involved, Tabitha said, thinking of the paltry amount of money she'd brought with her. She had no intention of asking Bert for money for her. He'd already traded 3 sandwiches for her after all. So be it. Mr. Small nodded to her as he walked toward his buggy. If you'd been kinder, I may have offered myself up as a husband. It was all Tabitha could do not to laugh at that comment. He didn't hold a candle to her Bert. As soon as the man was gone, Tabitha turned around to see Alice standing there, frowning at her. We'll tell Bert what happened as soon as he gets home, Alice said. Tabitha shook her head. No, I don't think that would be wise. I have some money I saved and brought with me. I will just pray it's enough. Alice shook her head. That's not going to work. Bert will be very upset if you don't at least talk to him about it. Maybe he will, but that doesn't mean I'm going to talk to him about it. Instead, I'll handle this on my own. All right. I'll wait a little while before I talk to him. For the next day or two, Tabitha prayed a lot about what was going to happen, even as her mind was working on ways to make some money, so she could handle the court case on her own. Finally, on Saturday afternoon, she sat down with Alice. Are there any bachelors in the area who would enjoy a home-cooked meal? Tabitha asked. I could make them here, and deliver them to the men, then pick up their dirty dishes after. That's a terrible idea, Alice said. You'd be alone with bachelors. I think you should just talk to Bert. But this isn't his problem. He traded 3 sandwiches for me. Of course, I made the sandwiches, so I don't know that they were his to trade. You're silly. Alice frowned. Could you agree to take a meal to Mr. Small's father twice a week? Would that appease the son? I have no idea. I wouldn't mind that, to be honest. Mr. Small Sr. is a very nice man. Confused, but kind. I wonder if we could take him some meals and give him a place, like the barn, to wait out storms. Would that be enough? I don't know. I'm not the type of person who would leave someone after they got off a stagecoach, and then expect them to marry the person I told them to marry, so I have no idea. Perhaps it would work. It's already cold enough that he needs a place to stay. Maybe you could take him warm clothes and some food. Maybe I could. Tabitha nodded. I'll make him a nice home-cooked meal and have Bert drive me down to the river to deliver it. And then I can work on a heavy shirt or even a coat this week and take it to him next week. Alice nodded. I think that's a much better idea than you driving around taking bachelors their meals. We know that Mr. Small Sr. is harmless. I'll get started on some mittens for him now. I believe I can have some ready by tomorrow, and I'll take him some of what I cook for us at Sunday dinner. That should keep his son at bay for at least a few days. That sounds good. But I really do think you should tell Bert what's going on. He would be happy to pay the man off. I just don't want him to have to spend his hard-earned money. That should be his to do what he wishes to do. I think he would strongly disagree. Tabitha was just putting supper on the table when Bert came in at the end of his day. He looked exhausted. I'm glad tomorrow is our day of rest, she said. He nodded. I am as well. I may even skip church so I can sleep all day. I was hoping you'd take me for a drive down by the river. I made some mittens for Mr. Small today, and I thought I'd take him a meal as well. Bert groaned. You are not beholden to that man. Of course, I'm not, but I can show him kindness, can't I? Kindness is always a good thing. He yawned. I'll drive you down after church. Then we'll sleep the rest of the day away. He pulled her against him. And I can have my way with you all afternoon? He asked. She laughed. I suppose you can. Asterisk. At church the next day, Tabitha's eyes scanned the crowd, hoping she wouldn't see either of the Mr. Smalls. Thankfully, neither was there. She dreaded the idea of running into the young Mr. Small with Bert around. She was afraid Bert would take matters into his own hands. He had a reputation for having a temper, though she hadn't seen it since the day they met, and that was more amusement than temper. Alice knew what Tabitha was doing, and whispered, "Just tell him." Tabitha shook her head. It wasn't so much that she was ashamed she'd married Bert instead of Jacob. It was that she didn't want him to have to waste his money to get her out of a lawsuit. No, instead, she'd simply deal with the matter on her own. She had Jacob's meal in the buggy, planning to head down to the river straight after church. It would give Bert more time to rest afterward. As they left the church, Betty grabbed her shoulder. I've heard you've had tea with all the ladies in town. I'm a lady. Tabitha smiled sweetly. You are a woman in town, yes. I don't plan to invite you for tea, though. You haven't been exactly kind. Betty huffed and followed her to the buggy. You can't say things like that to me. Bert stopped and looked at Betty. I think you need to remember that Tabitha is my wife, and as such, she deserves respect. Please don't say another word to her. Betty crossed her arms over her chest, but the look of disgust on her face wasn't surprising to anyone who looked at her. She had a reputation in town for being very difficult to deal with. Bert helped Tabitha into the buggy, kissing her as he did so. Tabitha knew the kiss was just to make Betty mad, so she participated in the kiss as much as she could. When he let her go and walked around the wagon, she knew he was happy with her. Betty didn't belong in either of their lives. Driving down to the river was more difficult than it had been a month earlier, when there had not been any snow. The riverbank was frozen, though the water still flowed. Jacob Small was there, herding his pigs. Well, hello, he called out. Tabitha got down from the buggy, carrying the meal and the mittens as well. I brought you some food. It was in a burlap sack, so she was able to hand it off easily. There's fried chicken and baked potatoes in there. And then she handed him the pure red mittens she'd made. And I thought this might keep your hands warm. You're the lady I traded for 3 sandwiches. Jacob said, his face lighting up as he realized who she was. I am. Is there anything else you need? Jacob shook his head. I'm just happy for the meal and the mittens. Thank you. You're very welcome. Are you building fires at night to keep warm? He nodded. If I get too cold, I find a barn to stay in. You're always welcome in our barn, she told him as she turned to walk back to the buggy. I'll bring you food again, if you'd like. Jacob nodded. The wife's not a very good cook. She's too busy waving her hands around saying silly things. He whispered loudly, I think she might be insane. Tabitha stifled the giggle that wanted to break free. She might be. As she and Bert drove away, she could see Jacob was looking at his tree wife contemplatively. As if he was trying to decide if he needed to get some help for her insanity. I feel much better about myself now that I've done that, she said. Now, let's go home and eat. I'm pretty hungry. They had fried chicken and mashed potatoes for lunch, along with some green beans. Is this what you took Jacob? Bert asked. I took him fried chicken and baked potatoes. I didn't think mashed potatoes would do well in a burlap sack, and I don't want to lose dishes by dropping them off to him, and him losing them. Makes sense. Your gravy is absolutely delicious. I think he'd give me back those 3 sandwiches if he knew just how good of a cook you are. Tabitha laughed. I'm not so sure of that. He did trade happily. That's true. Should we find an asylum to take him in? I think if he was starving or if he was a danger to others, that would be fine. But right now, he's simply odd. I don't think he needs an asylum yet. All right, Tabitha said skeptically. The man seemed like he needed to have someone care for him, and she wasn't about to be the one to do it. Helping him with small things made her happy, though. They spent the rest of the day sleeping and eating and enjoying one another. They even spent some time in the parlor reading, which had become a regular thing to do on Sundays. Polly rested beside Tabitha on the sofa. The kitten had to be right up next to her and touching her whenever she could. Several times, Tabitha's mind wandered from the book she was reading to her predicament, and then she'd find herself studying Bert. How on earth would he react when he found out she was being sued? Her reputation would be ruined, and there was no doubt about that. Would he have a problem being married to a woman whose reputation was in tatters? Finally, not long before bedtime, she found the words coming out of her mouth. Bert? He looked at her over the top of his book. Yes? She took a deep breath, needing to purge the secret from her conscience. Jacob Smith Jr. came to see me this week. He's the one who paid for me to come here, but an emergency came up, and he couldn't meet me at the stagecoach. Bert looked at her for a moment. You were supposed to marry a different Jacob Small? She shook her head. No, I was supposed to marry the one we thought. He was basically asking me to be a caretaker for his father. He says he's going to sue me for breach of promise. Didn't he promise to meet you at the stagecoach? Bert asked. That's the only reason you broke your promise. You thought you'd been lured out here and left on your own. I told him that, but he didn't agree. She sighed. I don't want my reputation ruined, but I'm not going to divorce you to marry a crazy man. I will give him a little more help because his son did pay for my journey here, but I'm happy married to you. I wouldn't be to him. No, of course you wouldn't. Bert frowned. Let the son take us to court. I'll pay whatever the fine the judge comes up with, but I think Jacob Small Sr. has a right to be at the trial, don't you? Are you angry with me? She asked. I do wish you'd told me sooner, but that would be a hard thing to do. So no, I'm not angry. We'll work through this together. Tabitha stood and walked over to Bert sitting on his lap in the armchair he preferred. Thank you, she said softly, kissing him. Don't ever be afraid to tell me when something goes wrong, he told her. We're a team now that we're married. If something is happening to you, it's happening to me as well. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I was afraid to tell you. I don't want you to have to spend money just to keep my reputation intact. Don't worry about the money. We can handle it. Well, that depends how much we're being sued for, doesn't it? Trust me, we can handle it. Polly jumped over to them then, sitting on Bert's chest. She obviously felt her place in the family was between them. They both laughed when she started rubbing her face on Bert's shirt, hoping to get some ear scratches. Having a kitten was the best thing Tabitha could think of. Chapter 10. 2 weeks later, Bert and Tabitha went to court, which was held right there in the church where they were married. She didn't know if she should be embarrassed or not, but there weren't a lot of people in court that day. Bert had decided to stop and get Mr. Small Sr. from his spot near the river. He ate the sandwiches Tabitha had packed for them on the way to court. You sure do make a fine sandwich, he told her with his mouth full. Thank you, she said softly, pleased he was always so happy with her cooking. He sat with them on a pew, and when his son came over to get him to sit with him, he said, This lady brings me food. You just bring me disappointment. Jacob turned his head away from his son and smiled at Tabitha. I sure did like that fried chicken. It was then that Tabitha realized he was wearing the mittens she'd made for him and the matching scarf they'd taken him just a week before. When the judge called the court to session, Tabitha found she was more nervous than she would have liked. Her character was on trial here more than anything else. Bert had hired an attorney to defend her, but she had a feeling it wouldn't do a lot of good. First, the attorney for Jacob Jr. opened stating that Tabitha had come west under false pretenses, and she had conned Jacob Jr. into paying her way. Bert almost came out of his seat a few times, wanting to argue with the lawyer, but the defense lawyer would simply shake his head and Bert would sit back down. Tabitha could feel him getting more upset by the minute. We'll have our say, she told him. Finally, as Jacob Jr. was on the stand and answering questions, Jacob Sr. stood up. He seemed to have just realized what the trial was about. He walked to the front of the church and looked at his son. I'm ashamed of you. I already have a wife, and I don't need another. Father, your wife is a tree. She looks over me and keeps me happy. What more could a man want? The lawyers both seemed to be startled as Jacob talked to his son in front of the church the way he was doing. I paid for Tabitha Murphy to come west and marry you. She didn't. It's that simple. Why was I never told I was supposed to marry her? You don't listen to me when I visit. You just keep calling your pigs cows and carrying that shepherd stick. I asked if I could live with you every time you came to visit me. And every time you refused. And now you think you can force me to marry a woman against my will? Well, it won't work. I traded her for 3 sandwiches, and it was the best trade I ever made. The judge narrowed his eyes. Did you ever want to marry Mrs. Blander? He asked. Jacob shook his head. I wouldn't have traded her for 3 sandwiches if I had, now, would I? I suppose not. Besides, even without being married to me, she brings me food, and these nice mittens. And this scarf. He lifted the scarf from his chest. Best bargain I ever made. If he wants to bring me another wife, I'll trade her for sandwiches too. There was laughter from the few people in the church. Jacob's lawyer looked utterly embarrassed. I'd like to call Mrs. Blander to the stand. Bert squeezed Tabitha's hand as she walked to the front of the church and sat in the chair indicated. After she was sworn in, the questions started. Did you agree to come west to marry the elder Mr. Small? Tabitha nodded. I did, but we're not looking for a story. Just answer the question, the lawyer said. And when you arrived, did you marry Mr. Blander within 24 hours? Yes, I did. She bit her tongue as she wanted to say more, but she knew the lawyer would just interrupt again. And before the younger Mr. Small went to your house, did you make any effort to meet with the elder Mr. Small? I did. You did? The lawyer asked, looking confused. But you didn't marry him? I was already married when I went to introduce myself to him. He made it clear he had no desire to marry me, and he was happily married to an oak tree. Tabitha felt like she'd won a small battle when he didn't interrupt her comments. Why didn't you tell the younger Mr. Small that you had done so when he came to your home? I did. The lawyer was now glaring at his client. You told him you had met his father? Yes, and I even told him that his father traded me for 3 sandwiches. I have no further questions, the lawyer said, moving to sit down, obviously annoyed at the turn his case was taking. The defense lawyer stood. When you arrived here, why did you not immediately marry Mr. Small? Tabitha sighed. No one came to meet me at the stagecoach, which were the prior arrangements we'd made. I thought I was stranded here, and I had no desire to go home. And what happened next? Mr. Blander was walking by, and I asked him about Mr. Small. He told me many things about Mr. Small, and I realized he simply wouldn't be a suitable husband for me, and Mr. Blander asked me to marry him instead. I made the choice to marry Mr. Blander, and I'm happily married to him now, 7 weeks later. How long was it between the day you arrived and the day the younger Mr. Small came to your door? 5 weeks. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't married Mr. Blander. I would have been completely alone over 1,000 miles from my parents. I knew no one. Did he tell you why he wasn't there the day you arrived? Or why it took him 5 weeks to come see you? No, he didn't give any reasons. He just started threatening me. Tabitha noticed that the younger Mr. Small was sinking down in his seat. I believe him leaving me at the stagecoach was breach of promise, was it not? It most certainly was. Her lawyer looked at the judge. I have no further questions. The judge frowned. I have a question. What's that? Tabitha asked. Did you take food and clothing to Mr. Small because you felt guilty for not marrying him? Not at all. I took him food and clothing because he is a kind man who lives all alone. I thought if I could make his day just a little bit better, then I should. You may take your seat, Mrs. Blander. The judge shook his head. I would like for both lawyers to approach the bench. Tabitha moved back to her seat beside Bert, and she clutched his hand tightly as she waited for what the judge would have to say about it all. Finally, the lawyers left, but the smile on her lawyer's face told her everything. I believe after hearing from all sides that Mrs. Blander did the only thing she could do when she married Mr. Blander. The only person here who is in breach of promise is Mr. Small. Now, I wouldn't usually have a problem with a man who had an emergency and didn't show up to greet his future stepmother, but the younger Mr. Small made this my business. I have fined him for the amount of my travel here, and I will ask that he pay to Mrs. Blander the equivalent of 5 weeks in a boarding house. I will have the figure sent to you, Mr. Small. The younger Mr. Small stood up to protest. That's not fair, Judge. She's the one who married someone else. I won't hear another word from you, Mr. Small. Then the judge turned to the elder Mr. Small. Do you need a place to live? There are places who will take good care of you. My wife and I do fine with our cattle. If my son ever decides to let me live with him, I won't say no, but I would still spend the summers with my wife and cattle. The judge smiled. Well, then we'll let you stay where you're happy. Do you need a ride home? Mr. Small shook his head. No, Mr. and Mrs. Blander will take me home. They are very kind to me. Much kinder than my son has ever been. The judge nodded. Isn't it nice to have such good neighbors? He asked. It certainly is. But I ate all my sandwiches on the way here. Is there anyone in town who runs a cafe or makes meals for others? Bert stood. There isn't, but if he'd like to come home with us for the night, we'd be happy to feed him. Then he smiled. I guess I should ask my wife if she's willing to feed him first, shouldn't I? I would think so, the judge said. Court dismissed. He pounded his little gavel and they all stood to leave. When Mr. Small joined them at the back of the church, Tabitha asked, Would you like to come home with us for a night? I'd feed you supper and then breakfast tomorrow, and my husband would take you home. Mr. Small shook his head. No, but I'll come by when it gets too cold to sleep outside, if that's all right. Tabitha nodded. That's fine. And I'll bring you some more food after church on Sunday. Mr. Small stopped walking and took Tabitha's hand. Trading you for those sandwiches is the smartest thing I've ever done. Tabitha laughed. You just let me know what your favorite meal is, and I'll be sure to bring it. Asterisk. Later that evening, after they'd had supper, Bert grinned at Tabitha. Our day in court was more than I could have asked for. I agree. I can't believe the judge decided that Mr. Small owes us money. That was crazy. Tabitha shook her head. And it didn't seem to hurt my reputation at all. No one was really there but the judge, lawyers, both Mr. Smalls, and us. I'm glad it was so easy. Now I just have to work twice as hard tomorrow, he said. Did you see the judge's face when the older Mr. Small told the court that he'd traded me for 3 sandwiches? I'd told his son that, but he didn't believe me. Bert laughed. My 3-sandwich bride. Who would have thought I'd get off so cheaply and end up married to the woman of my dreams? Woman of your dreams? She asked. Did you decide I was that before or after I kicked you? He grinned. After, of course. I could never marry a woman who couldn't stand up to me and fight with me for what she wanted. She shook her head. You're insane, Bert Blander. I think that may be why I love you so much. He looked at her for a moment. You love me? Don't say it if it isn't true. It's very true, she told him. I've loved you since I met with Gladys. Though why that showed me how wonderful you are, I'll never know. I've loved you since you kicked me and told me to stop laughing at you. Marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Though once I kissed you, the decision was out of my hands. She moved to sit on his lap again, her little shadow kitten jumping to sit between them. If you love me, then you won't be terribly disappointed with the news I have. News? He asked. I'm expecting. I've suspected for a few days, but now I'm certain. A baby? Already? He stared at her in disbelief for a moment. I'm not sure why you're surprised. It's not like we never make love. He grinned. I guess a baby is to be expected. He shook his head. I really didn't think it would happen so soon. My mother tried for years to have me. When she finally was expecting, she was extremely excited. I don't blame her. She had a mighty fine son too. He pulled her a little closer, making Polly squawk. As they kissed, it was as if all of the hardships in the world disappeared. They were definitely better together than they were apart. I'm going to be a father, he said, still a little stunned. Yes, you definitely are. Epilogue. It was late July when the baby finally came. Alice acted as midwife, as she had for Bert's birth. Tabitha's pains came early on a Monday morning, and the women decided together to not tell the men until they were home from work. Alice said she had no desire to have Bert and George underfoot all day. It was shortly after lunchtime when the baby made her way into the world. Tabitha kept staring at her daughter, not sure how she came to be. Tabitha had expected a son. Sons couldn't be traded for sandwiches. But she had a girl. They'd only picked out boys' names, so she had no idea what to call the little miracle she held in her arms. What was Bert's mother's name? Tabitha asked Alice, who was still cleaning up the bed. Cassandra, Alice said. She was called Cassie by her friends. Cassandra. Tabitha repeated the name a few times, trying to decide if it was too big a name for the tiny human she held. We could call her Candy. Alice smiled. I like that. Cassandra Ann? No, I think Cassandra Lynn. It just flows off the tongue. Now how am I going to tell Bert we had a girl? Both of us have been thinking it was a boy all along. Alice laughed. That little girl is going to have her daddy wrapped around her finger. He will love her instantly and forever. You think? I know. Sure enough, when Bert came in after work that evening, he walked into the parlor where Tabitha was sitting holding the baby. He stopped, his eyes widening. You didn't send someone to tell me the baby was on the way, he asked, seeming upset. Alice and I decided we didn't need men underfoot, she said. Everything went perfectly. Go wash that mud off your hands, and I'll let you hold her. Her? Bert looked like he was choking. It's a girl? I want to name her Cassandra Lynn, after your mother. For a moment, her big, tall cowboy looked as if he was about to cry. I'll go wash my hands. He hurried away, and when he came back a minute later, he looked more composed. Sitting beside her on the sofa, he reached out and traced the baby's tiny cheek. She's beautiful. Just like her mother. Tabitha laughed, though tears did fall down her cheeks. I was so sure we were having a boy. But God gave us the most beautiful baby in the world. Who could ask for more?